Hello my friends and welcome back to another Brotato guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today I'm going to be covering the worst weapon for every character. One of my most popular guides and most requested videos was when I went through and talked about the best starting weapon for every character, so today I'm going to flip that on its head and do the worst weapon for every character. You might sort of wonder why do this guide. I think there's a couple reasons. One, I just thought it would be really fun just going through and picking the worst weapon for every character. Two, I think there's actually still a lot to learn, because in order to decide why a weapon is the worst for a character, we need to talk about what makes a weapon choice good for a character and what that character does, why it's strong, and so on. And three, it's really useful, I think, to have this list all in one place for people who want to do challenge runs with the worst weapon character combinations. I'm also going to be picking some of my favorite weapon character combinations to do as videos, so if there's one that particularly speaks to you that you'd really like to see me do, definitely let me know in the comments and I will make that happen. Alright, so let's just jump right into it and start with the worst weapon for the Well-Rounded. The Well-Rounded, I think, gets access to a lot of sort of mid-tier weapons. You get one or two really high-tier weapons in SMGs and sticks, and a couple low-tier weapons. And one thing that you're going to notice as we go through this is that the same weapons are going to show up as the worst weapons over and over again. That's because in Brotato, some weapons are just better than others, and if you want to see which ones those are, definitely go check out my weapon tier list that I did. It's got a ton of great info on every weapon in the game. For the Well-Rounded, I think the worst weapon you have available is very likely to be the Wand. Wand struggles because it applies burning damage, which doesn't stack with itself. So if you have multiple wands, then the burning damage will not apply multiple times, so you're just relying on the base damage of the weapon, which is very low and doesn't scale very well. It has not much synergy with the Well-Rounded's abilities, although, of course, the Well-Rounded just gets really good stats, so you're going to be able to win with just about everything. And I should mention also that I think most of these builds, probably all of them, are still winnable, and that I'm going to be assuming that you are trying to use this weapon, not just selling it the first chance you get. Otherwise, what would be the point of this exercise? An honorable mention would be the pistol, because pistol is just the worst gun. It's a pretty weak weapon overall that doesn't do very much damage, but I think it's easier to create a winning build with pistol than it is with wand, so my pick is going to be the wand for the Well-Rounded. Brawler only gets access to 3 weapons, and the worst of these is definitely going to be the hand. It gives you a lot of harvesting, but it makes it hard to kill stuff. It doesn't synergize at all with your attack speed boost. Either of the other 2 weapons, I think the Brawler can sort of pretty easily cruise to victory, and the hand is going to be harder to play just because it doesn't kill stuff as fast, so you'll be relying on the harvesting in order to actually make money. Crazy. Crazy actually has access to only pretty good weapons for the character, I think. There's nothing here that's going to really struggle. Of the worst options, I think that the 2 that sort of come to mind here are the Lightning Shiv, because it's multi-attribute dependent. You need both elemental and physical damage to make it work, but you can just ignore the bouncing projectile and it will still be just a really solid precise weapon with 80% damage scaling and decent range and stuff. And the Thief Dagger, just because it's pretty low damage, but of course will snowball once you start generating money with it. Either of these, I think, are going to be the hardest weapons to win with, but the floor on the Crazy is still pretty high. Crazy, I think, is one of the best characters actually to just random weapons with, because you can put together a winning build with just about any of these combinations. The Ranger. You start with a pistol, and funnily enough, the pistol is the worst weapon for the Ranger. Crossbow is another consideration, but Crossbow does benefit a lot from the Ranger's starting range, and having just higher base damage on the Crossbow helps a ton. Normally it struggles in sort of the early to mid game because the damage scaling on it isn't high, and if you haven't found any range increasing items, then you just are stuck with sort of a low cooldown or a high cooldown, low damage weapon. But because the crossbow gets a boost from the ranger, I think it edges out the pistol, which is just a weak gun overall, and though you're going to end up in a gun build, if you have a starting pistol and pick a pistol, you're going to roll pistols more often in the shop, which is bad because it's a bad weapon, so that also hurts, and it's just going to have trouble keeping things off of you. It won't lifesteal as consistently as some of the other weapons, so it will be harder to sustain your health as well. And pistol also has the other problem of having native piercing, which is sometimes a downside for ranged weapons because it makes the piercing items worse, and the piercing is built into the sort of overall cost and stats of the weapon as an advantage, so making very powerful items less efficient is one of the downsides of pistol, and you'll probably be seeing pistol crop up a lot in this guide. Mage. Mage is a funny one because the best weapon is sort of a trick, and the best weapon, to spoil my other video for you, is the taser. The worst weapon, I think, is actually slightly odd on Mage. You can always just win with SMGs or shotguns, because that will help spread your fire a lot. I think just rapidly attacking lots of different enemies at a long range is pretty good. So the worst weapon for Mage, which only gets elemental damage scaling, I think is probably either the Wand, because Wand, like I mentioned, doesn't work with your native burning from the Mage, and also doesn't work with multiple wands, or my pick for the worst weapon, which is the Plank. Plank isn't going to do anything with your fire, because it is pretty low range, so you're not going to be able to apply the fire and then run away, and the explosive damage will be low because you are scaling it only off of elemental damage, since you can't build any other form of damage. It also doesn't give you any survivability, unlike some of the other weapons on this list. Torch, I think, is a very weak weapon overall, but there's only so bad that a weapon with the primitive weapon tag can be, because 15 HP just goes so far towards making your character viable that even though Torch is going to be the second worst weapon for a lot of builds, I think it actually is going to show up surprisingly infrequently as the actual worst weapon, because you can always just build tanky with it and use the primitive weapon tag to just do what you gotta do to survive. Chunky. Chunky is a funny one because a lot of weapons that are normally quite bad on most characters are really good on Chunky, because the max HP modification increased and the damage from HP. So for example, Torch or Rock both give you tons of HP, which is increased more by the Chunky's abilities, and that also increases your damage as you gain HP from it. So Rock, while often a bad choice on many characters, is quite strong, I think, on the Chunky. I think there's sort of two options for things that can be weak on Chunky. One is weapons that make it hard to generate consumables, since you kind of need those to heal. So Hand does suffer in that respect, but Hand is just a good weapon overall, so it's hard for it to be the weakest weapon. And the other is weapons that don't give you max HP and don't really benefit from the Chunky's abilities, so I think again the weakest weapon to choose here is the Plank. Plank requires damage scaling in multiple different attributes, which is hard to do for this character, and doesn't give you any form of additional HP or anything, so it doesn't synergize with the Chunky's abilities. Again, this is totally winnable. It's not like this character is going to be impossible to win with or anything, but I think that this is the weakest build for winning on Danger 5. The Old. The Old has, again, sort of two options, I think. A lot of the weapons that work poorly on other characters do work better on the Old, but I think that still the weakest weapon is going to be the Screwdriver. Old, I think, is one of the characters that can most easily use the Screwdriver, because the small arena makes your landmines way more effective, and the slow enemy movement speed means it's harder for them to catch you as you're just running around. But the Screwdriver is just a weak weapon overall that doesn't do a lot of damage, so I think that this is going to be the hardest build to win with on the Old, but also one of the most fun and satisfying if you do. Honorable mention again for the Wand, which just doesn't synergize with anything the old is trying to do. The smaller map size makes fire significantly less effective because the enemies have shorter distances to travel to get to you, although the enemy movement speed penalty means that it takes them longer to get to you over the same distance, so fire might have longer to tick. Also worth mentioning, I guess, is the rock, because you have minus movement speed, and the blunt weapon tag will give you even more minus movement speed, but the survivability it provides you is so high, and the harvesting bonus will let you just buy defensive stats. Any tanking build, I think, is totally fine on the old. The Lucky. Lucky wants to have survivability and be able to kill stuff. You have a huge attack speed penalty, which means that any weapon that relies on attack speed is going to suffer significantly. So we're looking for a weapon that doesn't provide survivability and relies on attack speed to perform its job, and that's going to bring us back to our old friend, the Plank. The funny thing about this is that Plank, I think, is not even like a terrible weapon. It just is so often thrown in as an extra weapon on a character that doesn't really have any synergies with it, so it so often ends up as the worst build for a character. The other option, I think, is the again, our old friends, the Wand and the Screwdriver, but Screwdriver does have some synergy with Lucky because the landmines don't care about your attack speed, obviously, and as they kill stuff, they're going to leave materials on the ground for you to go pick up. Similarly, fire will just leave random materials scattered over the map, which is what you kind of want on Lucky, so Wand is, I think, a little better there. But either of those could be the weakest, and all three of these, I think, are going to be quite difficult to win with on Lucky, which is a weak character without any defensive stats. So I'm going to pick the Plank, but Screwdriver or Wand are also pretty bad. The Mutant. Mutant pretty much gets access only to one weapon that doesn't work well with it. I guess two weapons that don't work well with it. The extra item price means that any weapon that requires damage scaling from multiple sources is going to be harder to work with. You can probably guess where this one's going. Because it's just more expensive, and weapons that are themselves quite expensive to buy suffer a lot for the Mutant, which means, once again, we're talking about the Plank. Planks actually have a very high base cost, which is one of the things that makes them kind of hard to build. They cost more than most other weapons, and so the 50% item price is going to sting more for the Mutant, for the Plank, than it will for most of these other weapons. Shotguns are also very expensive and kind of difficult to build on Mutants, but that's just a much better weapon overall, so it's easier to make that work. The Generalist. Generalist, well, so we don't have Plank and we don't have Wand, so we're going to have to pick something else here. Generalist benefits from weapons that scale with both melee and ranged damage. So one of the weapons that's often the worst is Cacti Club, although again, there's only so bad that a primitive weapon can be, but that has a lot of synergy with the Generalist's abilities. Similarly, ethereal weapons, which are often in the bottom half of weapons available, are better for this guy because the percent damage from Ghost Axe will scale your flat damage gain. That said, the ethereal weapons, I think, are pretty low down, but I think my pick for the worst weapon is just going to be the pistol. It's just a pretty bad weapon, and the damage scaling will... the gun build doesn't need weapon synergy, but it does mean that you will not have weapon synergy across your two types of weapons. So if you pick, like, Cacti Club and Slingshots, you get 6 primitive weapons. If you pick gun, there's no melee gun, and you need to have 3 melee weapons, so that means that you are capping your weapon synergies at 3. So pistol, I think, is going to be the worst. Loud has a ton of options, and for once it's not going to be the Plank because the explosions have a ton of synergy in terms of clearing the wave. I think that for the Loud, the worst weapon is going to be one that makes it hard for you to clear all of these enemies and hard to survive, and also one that doesn't provide a ton of income or clear power, and a support weapon is actually worse on the Loud than on other characters because it's going to eat the harvesting that you get from the support weapon, which is really built into those weapons. So while I don't think that it's unwinnable or anything, I think that the worst weapon on the Loud is actually the Pruner, because you are just going to be running from consumable to consumable, and the Pruner is going to have a lot of trouble clearing the wave. The Loud's harvesting penalty is going to eat the harvesting you gain from the support weapon tag, so it's going to take out one of the major advantages of the Pruner, and then you're going to have trouble clearing the lots of enemies because of the low damage of this weapon. The Multitasker. Multitasker, again, has a ton of weapons, and what we're looking for is a weapon that doesn't really get better in multiples and really wants to level up in order to do its thing, and so the weapon that we're looking for, of course, is the wand. Multiple wands, so 12 wands is not actually that much better than one wand, and wand really wants to level up, as with any flame weapon, because it makes the damage tick of the flames higher, so several low-level wands are worse than one higher-level wand, which goes counter to the multitasker's main purpose, so obviously the wand is going to be the worst for them. Wildling only gets primitive weapons, which means that there's only so bad we can get on the Wildling, primitive weapons being some of the best weapon sets in the game, and the 15 HP going really far towards making the Wildling, making any character viable. I think that the worst one is just going to be the Torch, although Rock is also pretty bad because it's hard for it to lifesteal, since it both knocks the enemies away and attacks really infrequently. Rock also benefits a lot from leveling up to level 3, so because you get more HP and more armor as you level it, but level 2 is still the best. So I'm going to pick Torch because it also is hard to lifesteal, and the elemental damage is not going to come into play, or if it does, then you're not using the lifesteal as often. Pacifist. There's no bad choice for Pacifist, but I think the worst is the Spiky Shield, actually, which I think is one of the best weapons in the game, but because it's not a support weapon, it doesn't give you any harvesting, and the Pacifist really wants some harvesting. It also gives you fewer defensive tools than the Hand, just because it attacks slightly less frequently and knocks back slightly less, and doesn't have the slow of Taser or the survivability of Pruner. The Gladiator. So Gladiator wants 6 different weapons, so whatever weapon we start with is not going to be the only weapon that we pick, and what that means is that we're looking for the worst weapon, we're looking for a weapon that puts us in a weapon tag that doesn't have a lot of other options, which to minimize the synergy bonuses that we're going to get. The worst weapon, I think, for the Gladiator is going to be the Plank, because that puts us in Explosive, of which there are no other level 1 explosive melee weapons, and Elemental, of which there's only one, the Torch. So that means that we are minimizing our synergy bonuses if we take the Plank. And also, while the attack speed is quite beneficial for Planks, just because they normally attack quite slowly, it makes our synergy bonuses worse. Honorable mention, I guess, to the ethereal weapons, which you typically want to stack many of so that you're actually building up stats with them. But I think overall throwing in 1 Ghost Axe or 1 Ghost Flint and then just building normally for your other weapons is going to help with the Gladiator anyways. So the worst weapon, I think, is the Plank, that makes it really hard to get into a full set of synergy weapons, of weapon synergies. The Saver. Saver, you have the same problem of any expensive weapon is going to suffer, but you actually don't have access to too many expensive weapons. The only really expensive one you have access to is the Spear, and the percent damage is strong. The ability to generate money is good because you start with a bunch of harvesting, so a support weapon like the Taser is going to work pretty well. I think that overall the worst item, even though it's not that expensive, is going to be the Wand, although I think You could do an honorable mention to the Ghost Flint, which is going to have a lot of trouble keeping you alive and will be very hard to build into because of the extra item price, but it will let you get going a little faster, or you'll be stronger overall in the end game because you have the bonus attack speed, and then of course the 1% damage scales well with attack speed. It also does scale well with the burning damage, but I think that Wand is going to have the most trouble clearing the early waves and getting your snowball rolling and keeping you alive in the difficult mid-game for this character when your item price penalty is really hurting you and your economy hasn't kicked in yet. The Sick. So what we're looking for here is a weapon that is difficult to lifesteal with and doesn't give us defensive stats or HP, so the worst weapon for the Sick, I think, is going to be the Hand. Because Hand knocks all the enemies back by 30, it's actually really hard to get consistent lifesteal out of it, and while it does give you the unarmed dodge bonus, it doesn't give you any max HP or any other way to regenerate health or anything. And while the support weapon tag and the harvesting from the Hand are really good, it doesn't have like native lifesteal attached to it like the Scissors, which will have 65% lifesteal, or the Medical Gun, which will also have 65%. So it's not going to keep you alive in the same way, and knocking back enemies from the Sick is really difficult. The Ghost Scepter, you will also probably struggle in the early game just because it won't be applying the lifesteal that often, but because it's a ranged weapon, it will very quickly start applying the lifesteal more often, and stacking HP on the Sick is really good. But I think that the worst weapon overall is going to be the Hand. The Farmer. Farmer gets the unique joy of buying the worst weapon in the game, the Potato Launcher, and that is going to be the worst starting weapon for the Farmer. It is a support weapon, but it just doesn't do any damage, and it doesn't give you any consumable drops. Because it's not going to be killing anything in the early game, it will give you even fewer consumable drops, so you're not going to be generating the harvesting that you need to get going on the Farmer. Either killing stuff or just generating a lot of consumables is how the Farmer wins, so the Potato Thrower doesn't kill stuff and doesn't generate consumables. It's just a really terrible weapon overall, other than for Endless Mode, so it's going to be the worst weapon here. The Ghost. Any of these weapons are fine. I think that the hardest to build is the Ghost Flint, although this will also give you the strongest late game. But the Ghost Axe gives you slightly more materials in the early game because it clears the first waves better thanks to the large swing arc, and the Ghost Scepter means that you'll be getting more Ghost Scepters, and HP is the most important stat to generate on the Ghost, I think. So Ghost Flint will have the strongest late game build, but be slightly harder to play. Any of these are fine, though. The Speedy. We're looking for one that doesn't, a weapon that doesn't care about, or doesn't scale with melee damage, and that won't clear the way in front of you, meaning that you're gonna like accidentally run into enemies a lot because of how fast you're moving. And so my pick for that weapon is the Screwdriver. The melee damage scaling of 50% is really painful. The landmines will often not have time to kill stuff before you run into it. You can't stand still and force enemies to come to you, or stand still and wait on a mine to then blow it up by stepping off of it as easily, because you take double damage whenever you stand still. And the Screwdriver also attacks slowly enough and is short-ranged enough and does little enough damage that it won't clear the path for you as you're running around as the Speedy. The Entrepreneur. So, Entrepreneur benefits from weapons that don't care much about damage, and suffers if your weapons have sort of low damage but need to build damage. So, like, good weapons are things like the Hand or the Wrench, which don't really care about damage and give you money. Bad weapons, conversely, are going to be ones that need to build damage, and that includes all kinds of damage, elemental damage, and so on. I think that of these, the worst is going to be the Pistol, although, again, honorable mention to the Wand, just because Wand is a rough weapon to start with for pretty much any character. But I think it's easier here because you will be able to build up your elemental damage a little faster thanks to your increased economy. And the thing that makes Wand difficult is that you need your burning ticks to kill the enemies in like 1 or 2 hits. pretty quickly, and so scaling the elemental damage fast will improve the power of the wand, whereas it's much harder to scale your pistol to the point where it's actually clearing waves. Engineer. So engineer, you get extra engineering, and so all of these weapons are going to be fine. I think the worst one is probably going to be the hammer. The blunt weapon, it doesn't use your engineering boost, of course, and the blunt weapon tag slows you down, which means that you are going to have trouble getting away from enemies. So the damage modification being reduced by 50%, of course, means it's harder for the hammer to clear stuff. That said, hammer is a decent enough weapon with good enough base damage and scaling that you can still make this work, but I think it's going to be harder than the other builds, other things that just scale with engineering and so are going to be fine. Rare time where the plank shows up and is not one of the worst starting weapons. The Explorer. So you want to kill trees and run around chopping trees, so weapons that make that harder are going to be the worst. There is no option to take like a rock, which would be probably the worst possible weapon for this character because it slows you down. But I think that the ones that are going to have the most trouble killing trees are going to be stuff like the Taser, which will just have a lot of... no, you start with a lumberjack shirt, actually, so any attack on a tree will be fine. So in that case, actually, I think that there's not really a truly awful weapon for the Explorer, since you can just chop trees with any weapon. So it's probably going to be the wand again. The extra enemies do synergize significantly with the plank, so it's probably not plank. And similarly, like the crossbow and the hatchet do okay. Hatchet, of course, has a flavor synergy as well, because you're chopping down all the trees. I think I'm going to go with wand, but I think this is fairly close, because I just don't think that there's a really bad choice for the Explorer. The map size helps with the elemental damage, because the enemies will typically have longer to burn. So having the wand damage does help there, but because there are more enemies and wand has pretty slow clear times, and if you don't get the elemental spread, it also... Scared Sausage and Snake won't spread the fire to the trees, or rather, Snake won't spread fire to trees, I don't believe, so you can get in trouble trying to hit trees that are in groups of enemies, so I think it's going to be wand, but that's a close one. Doctor, I guess the worst one, very, very slightly, is Medical Gun, but these are obviously so close together and both so powerful that it doesn't really matter. Hunter, I think the worst one is going to be the Claw, because the range on Claw does help, and crit chance helps a lot, but your max HP is going to be really bad, and so Claw is going to suffer a lot in terms of the unarmed bonus doesn't scale very well with low max HP, since it gives you dodge, and dodge scales with your maximum HP. And Claw is also just not going to have the damage that you need to clear the wave quickly. It could also be Thief Dagger for the same reasons, but Thief Dagger giving you materials does help a lot, and that also helps overcome the loss of harvesting that the Hunter gets. Thief Dagger gaining bonus range is also, I think, better than Claw gaining bonus range, just because of the cooldowns on the weapon attacks. Artificer, I think that the worst one for Artificer is going to be the Wrench, because wrenches actually rely very heavily on the damage from the actual wrench to clear the early wave, so it's going to cripple your early economy, since it's the only weapon that doesn't scale with your massive explosion damage boost. Arms Dealer, the best and worst weapon are the same, of course. Streamer. This is a weird one. So Streamer has access to like just about every weapon. You want to stand still, but you also want to move quickly. I think that the worst weapon on Streamer is going to be the Rock, which it's a little odd to pick because I think Rock is not often the worst weapon, but the blunt weapon tag reducing your speed hurts a lot for Streamer, which is going to have very low speed, and also it makes it hard. The rock is going to make it hard for you to stand still and still clear the wave. Streamer really benefits from a ranged weapon. Wand, again, might be another option here, just because it doesn't clear the waves very fast, so it might force you to move. Like, usually the play pattern with elemental weapons is to set things on fire, move away from them, and then let them die slowly. Streamer doesn't have that option, but because you have the extra damage while moving, things will burn pretty quickly to your wand damage ticks, and you can also just play this character as a without using the passive that much. So I think that rock is going to be worse, because the thing that gets you killed on Streamer is just moving slowly, especially against elites. You have to spend so much money buying movement speed that making that worse is going to make you suffer. Cyborg. So Cyborg, you start with a minigun, but you are an engineering build for half of the time. The worst on Cyborg is just going to be the pistol, because the weapons that scale with engineering are all fine for the Cyborg, and the better guns are also fine. You can just clear stuff in the early game and rely on your lifesteal to keep you alive with the minigun and SMGs. Like, you can just go minigun and 5 SMGs and do great, even though you're not usually killing stuff in the second half of the wave. But pistol doesn't really help with the lifesteal and doesn't help with the wave clear, doesn't scale with engineering, so that's going to be the worst. Honorable mention to the crossbow, which is very similar to the pistol in that respect. But crossbow does have the advantage of you can still just buy range, and it will keep the range damage scaling. It'll keep the damage scaling from range, whereas the other weapons all scale with only ranged damage, and so we'll lose the damage scaling when your form swaps halfway through the wave. The Glutton. So Glutton, you just want to pick up a lot of consumables, which means we need to generate consumables on the ground. We have bonus luck. I think that the worst for Glutton, and we get extra explosion damage, which synergizes with explosion-style weapons, like the plank, shredder, or screwdriver. I think the worst for the Glutton is going to be the Thief Dagger. It doesn't really synergize with your character. Generating extra materials is actually not as relevant, because each material is less valuable thanks to the increased item price. And it's going to have a lot of trouble clearing the waves in the early waves, which means you won't be generating as many consumables to start increasing your explosion damage, which, to be fair, the Thief Dagger doesn't care about the explosion damage, but when you're not generating consumables and using the Glutton's passive, I think that is what makes it really difficult to play. So I think the Thief Dagger is the worst option here. The Jack. So Jack has very few but very high health enemies, so we're looking for a weapon that mostly does AoE damage and doesn't do single target damage, or a weapon with very low DPS. And I think that the worst weapon here is going to be... I actually don't hate the wand on the Jack, because you can set the enemy on fire and then back off, so that one helps. There's a lot more room to maneuver on the Jack, so the wand is less bad. Not having wave clear isn't as painful. I think that the torch is slightly worse than the wand, even despite the primitive weapon tag, because enemy damage being increased makes the primitive weapon tag less valuable than it is on a normal character, and having to get into melee to apply the burning and then run away means that any fast enemy is going to probably tag you. If you start taking hits on the Jack, then you're in trouble, so the torch is going to be really, I think, the worst option for the Jack. Another possibility is the hatchet, which just does pretty low damage, and normally the thing that makes the hatchet good is its wide swing speed. Actually, I've kind of convinced myself. I think the hatchet is worse than the torch. And then honorable mention, as always, for the pistol, which just does low damage, and one of the things you pay for on the pistol is its piercing, which doesn't really matter for Jack. For the Lich, we are looking to apply small healing instances over and over again. So any weapons that lifesteal or let us heal, I think are actually really good. Weapons that don't allow us to heal easily or apply lifesteal frequently are going to be the worst kinds of weapons. So I think actually, because you can lifesteal pretty well with wands, I think that the worst weapon is actually the crossbow, which attacks quite slowly. Any of these weapons I think are fine for the Lich, but I guess actually it could also be the ghost flint. Oh, yeah, no, sorry. I have changed my mind completely. The Ghost Flint is the worst weapon for the Lich, because you're going to be stealing kills from your ethereal weapons with your passive, and anytime you're stealing kills from your ethereal weapons, they're very inefficient. And Ghost Flints also are melee and attack infrequently, so they're not going to give you the lifesteal that you need, and they won't be building attack speed because you're going to be healing and stealing your kills from them with your passive, so the Ghost Flint will not be building up as much attack speed. So, sorry, Wand, I know I've been talking a lot of shit about the Wand in this video, but in this case, it's actually the Ghost Flint that's the worst. Apprentice. So any weapon that gives you HP is really strong on the Apprentice, so something like even a typical suspect like the Torch we're going to not worry about, and because Apprentice has damage scaling with multiple damage types and gets like free elemental damage, which is the hardest damage type to build, some weapons that often struggle, such as Plank, are actually quite good on the Apprentice because you get lots and lots of free elemental damage and melee damage and engineering as you level up, so Plank actually scales at 150% using all three of its damage type scaling for the Apprentice. So we're looking for a weapon that scales badly with flat damage and doesn't give us any HP and only has one kind of damage scaling. I think that the worst weapon using those metrics is going to be the pistol, but another possibility I think is the screwdriver. We do get a lot of free engineering, but Screwdriver just does make it hard to clear waves and doesn't give us any HP or survivability, so that one suffers a lot. I think that the pistol edges it out as the worst choice overall, just because of the bad scaling that it has like 100% range damage scaling, but it attacks pretty infrequently and in a bad weapon pattern. But I actually think that Screwdriver is maybe a little bit worse. Screwdriver will end up as a decent weapon, though, because it does get melee and engineering scaling, so just the actual Screwdriver attacks will be good. I'm kind of waffling on this one, actually. I didn't think this would be so hard to pick a worst weapon, but I keep, picking a weapon and then being like, oh, actually, that one has some synergy with this class, because flat damage, building flat damage is so powerful. And it's hard for it to be something like Pruner, which just gives you the support weapon tag and a bunch of healing, so it keeps you alive. So I think I'm going to go with pistol, but actually now that I'm kind of looking at it, the overall worst weapons on Apprentice are not that bad, because they do benefit from the damage scaling. Cryptid. So Cryptid, you want to not be breaking trees, which means that we need to avoid a weapon that will accidentally kill trees a lot by spraying fire everywhere. And we don't get lifesteal, so any weapon that relies on lifesteal to typically heal is going to be much worse. So I actually think that in a shocking twist, the worst weapon for the Cryptid might be the submachine gun, because it's going to spray fire everywhere. Normally what gives the submachine gun its power is its ability to lifesteal, which you can't use on the Cryptid. And it's going to be accidentally breaking trees a lot, which you do need those trees to survive to make money. The other options are other ranged weapons like the Shredder or the pistol. I think any of those three are going to suffer, and it might just be the pistol anyways, even though the submachine gun will break trees more often, but submachine gun does more damage overall. But I think that I actually think the submachine gun is the hardest, because it's going to be by far the hardest to control whether you're breaking trees or not, even with directional fire. So I'm going to go with that and say that in a weird twist for the Cryptid, one of the best weapons in the game is the worst starting weapon for Cryptid. Fisherman. So Fisherman, we need to be bursting down the bait aliens right at the beginning of the round, so we're looking for any weapon that lets us do that as quickly as possible. So I think that the worst weapon for Fisherman is going to be the Torch, because Torch relies on the burning damage to kill things. It will give the bait aliens like a second run at you, and that's going to be really rough, whereas most of these other weapons you can get the damage high enough to just one-shot them. The Torch, of course, doesn't do that since it uses the burning damage. And if the bait aliens get enough charges at you, you're going to take damage on the Fisherman, so it's very hard to avoid that. So even though it gives you HP, the Torch, I think, is going to be the worst, because the massive amount of damage scaling we get on every other weapon will help it clear things in one hit, sort of no matter what. Another option might be the Screwdriver, because, of course, the mines won't have populated in time to clear things out, and the percent damage doesn't affect the Screwdriver. Actually, yeah, I've changed my mind. So the Screwdriver, because the percent damage from your bait doesn't affect the Screwdriver, you're not going to be able to one-shot the aliens with it, so except with the actual melee attacks of the Screwdriver, which is going to be even harder, I think, than the burning damage from the Torch to consistently apply. So that's going to give the enemies more chances to hit you overall. So yeah, the worst weapon for the Fisherman is the Screwdriver. The Golem. So we want a weapon that, if we're looking for a weapon that we think is the worst, we want one that normally, one of the major benefits of it is that it gives you lifesteal. One that doesn't give us like max HP or armor or anything like that, so we're probably not looking for a primitive weapon. Even though something like the Slingshot, normally one of the main benefits is that it lets you lifesteal, but of course the Golem can't do that. But Slingshot's still just really good damage overall. I think that the worst weapon for the Golem is probably going to be the Chopper, because even though it scales with your HP, so it's going to deal decent damage, the plus HP from consumables doesn't do anything on the Golem, since you can't heal at all, and that's a big chunk of what you're paying for on the Chopper. So you will end up with quite decent damage, but it's easy to get good damage on the Golem, because you have just a bunch. You're not buying anything other than damage and survivability, since you're not buying any healing at all. What's difficult is getting ways to survive, and the blade weapon tag is completely wasted, or almost completely wasted on the Chopper, since the melee damage scales only at 50% and the lifesteal is useless, and the plus HP from consumables is useless on the Golem, so Chopper is the worst. The King. King gets level 2 items to start with, which goes a long way. A lot of bad items are much better starting at level 2. So we're looking for an item that doesn't really care about leveling up, and doesn't benefit from bonus luck, and suffers a lot from losing percent damage and attack speed. I think that there aren't really a lot of weapons that fit that bill. Like, for example, the Torch benefits quite heavily from leveling up, so I think that actually the King does quite well with torches. Similarly, the Plank gets extra damage scaling from leveling up, the Lightning Shiv gets extra bounces, and so on. I think that the weapon that actually benefits least from leveling here and suffers the most from losing percent damage and attack speed is the Fist. Fist is such a good weapon overall that it is going to do well regardless, but I think that it's kind of Fist or Hatchet are the weapons that I'm looking at as worst picks for the King, and the Hatchet has the primitive weapon tag, so again, there's just only so bad it can be, and because you have primitive weapon gives you HP, which is really important for the King, since you'll be losing HP as you buy items. So Fist doesn't give you HP, gives you dodge, which scales poorly with your lower HP, and really suffers from losing out on damage. On damage and attack speed. Benefits less from leveling up than most of these weapons as well. So we're going to pick Fist as the worst for the King. There's really only so bad that the Renegade can be. It just benefits so much. The extra projectiles matter a lot. But one thing that is difficult for the Renegade is that the +2 projectiles is flat. Weapons that already have multiple projectiles get much less benefit from the Renegade's ability. So I think that the worst one is actually going to be the shotgun, because shotgun normally fires 4 pellets, Renegade only increases it by 50% in terms of damage output, whereas all the single shot weapons it increases by 200%. So the Renegade's boost is significantly different and significantly worse for multi-shot weapons like the shotgun. So shotgun, I think, is going to be the worst overall for the Renegade. Honorable mention again for the wand, although multiple projectiles is better than multiple wands, because those will set the fire across a whole crowd, rather than multiple wands, which will all target the same thing and set the fire on the same enemy over and over again. Multiple projectiles means spreading the fire out, which is really good. So the Renegade, I think, actually does better with the wand as a starting weapon than many other classes, and in fact, I think Wand Renegade is pretty good. One-armed. So we want a weapon that doesn't scale with attack speed and wants to be in multiples. So something like Wand or Torch is actually not going to be the worst for the one-armed, because the major downside of those weapons is that they don't scale in multiples, and they do scale really well with % damage, with damage modifications, and attack speed, because then you can spread the fire out a lot. I think we're looking for a weapon that also doesn't benefit from damage and benefit from attack speed, and so the weapon that I think is the worst is the screwdriver. Attack speed barely matters on the one-armed. The one landmine won't do anything, and the damage modification... attack speed barely matters to the screwdriver. Since the damage on it is low, the engineering scaling will not benefit from your damage modification boost, and the landmine doesn't benefit at all from your damage modification or attack speed. Having one landmine on the ground is kind of sad, so the screwdriver is the worst for the one-armed. Obviously, the bull doesn't get to pick a weapon, so we can skip that one safely. The soldier. Soldier needs to stand still, so we're looking for a melee weapon. I think the hardest one to play on soldier is the knife. Just standing still and having just normal 150 range is really difficult to manage. I don't think this is a weak build, but I think it's a very hard build to play, because you have to get into melee range and then stop moving, so you're going to end up with a very difficult game overall. And the bonus damage and attack speed actually helps a lot for something like the wand, especially because the soldier wants to attack, reposition, and then attack again, which is the normal play pattern for elemental weapons. So wand actually synergizes very well with the soldier, whereas melee weapons are synergize very poorly. The masochist. So we need to be tanky, which means we need to take damage. Something that doesn't help with that is going to be more difficult than something that does help with that. And we get a lot of regeneration and armor, minus 100% damage. So I kind of want to say wand again, just because the wand doesn't help us with survival, but I actually think that the masochist plays pretty well with elemental weapons, because as you build up the damage, you've already got the fire on a bunch of enemies, and that will increase the damage of subsequent fire ticks. So it actually, since the masochist is kind of a slow burn, if you'll excuse the pun, building up to doing more damage overall, the fire weapons actually work pretty well with it, I think. So I think that the worst one is actually going to be the Ghost Scepter, because obviously the HP is really good, but Ghost Scepter needs to get a lot of kills during the wave in order to start building HP, and you don't kill stuff at the beginning of the wave. So it's going to take a long time for this to start building up. It also doesn't give you... It makes your armor worse. So while it does give you dodge, it reduces your armor, which means that your survivability isn't as powerful as you might otherwise think, and it doesn't otherwise give you survivability until it starts building up damage. It doesn't work very well with lifesteal, which I think is really important for the masochist just because it attacks pretty slow. So I think the worst is going to be the Ghost Scepter, although I'm pretty sure all of these weapons can work just fine because the masochist is such a powerful character. The Knight, again, these weapons all start at level 2, which has very strong benefits for a number of them. We want one that doesn't scale well with melee damage because you get lots of melee damage and doesn't give us armor. So like something like the hammer works really well because it's got 150% melee damage scaling. So I think we're looking for the torch. Again, there's only so bad the torch can be because it's got primitive and elemental tags. It just does a lot of damage with the primitive. It gives you a lot of health, and the elemental tag on a level 2 torch gives you a lot of damage. Also, the attack speed loss is less impactful on elemental weapons than on other weapons. Since you're just applying the burning, you don't care about attacking that frequently. So I think that the Knight has a pretty high floor again, and the torch is going to be very viable, but I think of these options, it's the worst overall. And finally, the Demon. So Demon needs to spend HP in order to gain items in the shop, so anything that doesn't give us materials and doesn't give us HP is going to be the things that are worst. So I think that overall the worst item for this is going to be the Chopper, because we spend our max HP. If we're not building that up in some way, like with Ghost Scepter or with a primitive weapon tag, the damage scaling on the Chopper is going to be really bad, and it clears things since we're spending it. And it clears things quite slowly, so we're not going to get a lot of materials in order to convert those into max HP and have the Chopper actually do some damage. So I think that Chopper is going to be the worst just because it doesn't have any synergy with the Demon's abilities, other than if you picked these up in like the late game, they'd be quite good because you'd have a lot of HP. But in the early game, they're not going to do any damage, and that's going to make the Demon, which is a very snowball-y character, much harder to play. Alright, that went a little longer than I thought it would. I didn't think there'd be so much to say about each character, but I'm pretty happy with that discussion. I think the worst weapon on each character is a pretty fun little guide. As always, I hope that you've enjoyed this, and if you have, do please like the video, leave a comment, that helps a ton with the algorithm, and let me know which of these builds are your favorite and you want to see them in action. I will see which ones I can make happen. I think that of these, only a couple I think are unwinnable. Like, I think Rocks on Streamer is pretty close to unwinnable. I think Choppers on Demon is pretty close to unwinnable. But almost all of the others I think are winnable, and even those two I think are probably possible just with good play and good luck. And as always, my friends, thanks so much for watching, and I will catch you next time. Cheers, and GG.